Picture this. It's 1947. The world is still recovering from the deadliest war in human history. Nations are rebuilding. People are trying to return to normalcy. But at the bottom of the world, in the most isolated place on Earth, something impossible is happening. Something that will make you question everything you think you know about our planet. And if you're someone who loves mysteries that science still can't explain, you're going to want to stick around for this one. Hit that subscribe button because stories like these don't come around often, and trust me, you'll want to share this with everyone you know after hearing what I'm about to tell you. Antarctica. The name itself evokes images of endless white horizons, brutal cold, and absolute desolation. It's a continent that actively tries to kill you. To temperatures that can drop to minus 128 degrees Fahrenheit, winds that scream across the ice at over 200 miles per hour, darkness that lasts for months. This is not a place for human beings. Yet in the summer of 1947, a small research station stood defiant against this hostile environment. And in that station, a meteorologist named David Carmichael was about to stumble onto something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. David wasn't supposed to be there. He was a last-minute replacement for another scientist who had fallen ill just days before the expedition was scheduled to depart. A quiet man in his early 30s, David had spent most of his career at a weather station in Alaska, recording temperatures, wind speeds, and atmospheric pressure with the methodical precision that defined his entire personality. He was the kind of person who double-checked his measurements, who kept meticulous notes, who never made assumptions. The perfect meteorologist, the perfect observer, the perfect witness to the impossible. The research station, designated Station Echo by the American military who funded the operation, was established as part of a larger Antarctic survey program. Officially, it was about gathering climate data, understanding weather patterns, establishing territorial claims through scientific presence. But if you dig deeper into the declassified documents from that era, you'll find something interesting. Station Echo was positioned in one of the most remote and inaccessible parts of the continent, far from any other research outpost, yet in a region where the magnetic field behaves strangely, where compasses spin without reason, where radio communications cut in and out like someone flipping a switch. David arrived at Station Echo on January 15, 1947. The Antarctic summer was in full swing, which meant about 20 hours of daylight and temperatures that occasionally climbed all the way up to a balmy 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The station itself was a collection of prefabricated buildings connected by rope lines, essential for navigating during the whiteout conditions that could descend without warning. There were 8 men stationed there, a geologist, a biologist studying extremophile organisms, 2 engineers to keep the generators running and the buildings from being buried in snow, a radio operator, a cook who also served as the medical officer. You had the station commander, a gruff Navy officer named Lieutenant Morrison, and David, the meteorologist, who was about to discover that the world was far stranger than anyone imagined. For the first 2 weeks, everything was routine. David set up his instruments with care, calibrating each one multiple times to ensure accuracy. He had barometers for measuring atmospheric pressure, thermometers positioned at various heights to track temperature gradients, anemometers to measure wind speed, and a series of specialized instruments to monitor atmospheric phenomena. Every 6 hours, like clockwork, he would make his rounds, recording data in his weather log with neat, precise handwriting. He would then transmit this information via the radio operator to the main research coordinating station over 1,000 miles away. The data was boring. Predictable. Exactly what you would expect from one of the most stable, unchanging environments on Earth. Until January 31st. David woke up that morning feeling strange. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. There was a pressure in his head, a sensation like the air itself had become thick, viscous, harder to breathe. He mentioned it to the cook during breakfast, but the man just laughed and said it was probably just the isolation getting to him. Everyone felt weird after a few weeks in Antarctica. Your body never quite adjusted to the constant daylight, the dry air, the complete absence of any smell other than diesel fuel and unwashed men. But when David went to check his instruments at 0600 hours, He found something that made his blood run cold despite the layers of insulated clothing. So the barometer reading was wrong, not just a little off, catastrophically wrong. According to his instrument, the atmospheric pressure had dropped by nearly 40 millibars in the last 6 hours. That kind of pressure drop doesn't happen. It can't happen. A decrease like that would signal the approach of the most violent storm system ever recorded, the kind of weather event that would be visible from space, the kind of storm that would wipe Station Echo off the map. But outside, the sky was clear, painfully, impossibly clear. David could see for miles across the ice sheet, the visibility so perfect it was almost unreal. There was no wind, not even a breeze. The flags hanging outside the main building were completely still, frozen in place not by ice but by the absolute absence of air movement. It was the kind of calm that feels wrong, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. David's first instinct was instrument failure. He checked the barometer, inspecting every seal, every connection. He tapped it gently, wondering if something had jammed, but the instrument appeared to be functioning perfectly. More troubling, he had 2 backup barometers, different makes and models, positioned in different locations around the station. He checked them both. They showed the same impossible reading. A pressure drop that should have heralded the apocalypse under skies so clear you could count the stars even in the perpetual daylight. He recorded the readings in his log, his hand shaking slightly as he wrote. Then he checked the thermometers. And that's when the bottom dropped out of his understanding of reality. The temperature readings made no sense. His primary thermometer, positioned 5 feet above the ground, read minus 23 degrees Fahrenheit, normal for this time of year in this location, but the thermometer positioned at 10 feet read minus 8 degrees. The one at 15 feet read positive 18 degrees. Temperature increases with altitude. The air gets warmer as you go up. This is impossible. Temperature should decrease with altitude, not increase. It's called the lapse rate, one of the fundamental principles of atmospheric science. What David was seeing violated basic physics. He stood there in the endless daylight, staring at his instruments, wondering if he was losing his mind. Antarctica does that to people. The isolation, the sensory deprivation, the constant light or constant darkness depending on the season. Polar madness, they called it. Explorers from earlier expeditions had reported hallucinations, paranoia, a complete disconnect from reality. Was that happening to him? Was his brain, starved for normal stimuli, creating phantom data to give him something, anything, to break the monotony? But the instruments didn't care about his mental state. The numbers were there, recorded in mercury and mechanical precision, 40 millibars, impossible temperature gradients. And something else he noticed as he stood there, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up despite the cold. The light was wrong. You have to understand something about Antarctica to appreciate what David was seeing. The light there is unlike anywhere else on Earth. The ice reflects almost all the sunlight that hits it, yet creating a glare so intense it can cause snow blindness in minutes without proper eye protection. The sky takes on a particular quality, a kind of flat brightness that makes it hard to judge distances, hard to tell where the ground ends and the sky begins. It's disorienting, surreal, but it follows predictable patterns based on the sun's position, the cloud cover, the atmospheric conditions. What David saw that morning followed no pattern he recognized. The sky was the wrong color, not blue, not the pale gray of overcast conditions, but a shade of violet he'd never seen before. It wasn't uniform either. Bands of color rippled across the sky like auroras, but auroras don't appear in daylight, and they certainly don't look like this. So these weren't the familiar curtains of green and red caused by solar particles interacting with the magnetosphere. These were geometric patterns, sharp-edged and precise, forming shapes that almost looked intentional. David pulled out his notepad and tried to sketch what he was seeing, but his pencil couldn't capture it. The patterns moved too quickly, shifting and reforming in ways that hurt to watch. He felt that pressure in his head intensify, a throbbing that seemed to pulse in time with the lights in the sky. He took off his goggles, wondering if they were somehow distorting his vision, but the patterns were still there, even clearer now, so clear that he had to look away. He stumbled back to the main building, his mind racing. He needed to report this. He needed to tell someone. But what would he say? showed that the barometric pressure had dropped 40 millibars with no storm, that temperature was increasing with altitude, that the sky was the wrong color and showing geometric patterns that made his head hurt. They would think he'd cracked. They would evacuate him on the next supply flight and his career would be over. Inside the main building, he found Lieutenant Morrison reviewing supply inventories. The commander looked up as David entered, his weathered face creasing with concern. David must have looked as unsettled as he felt, because Morrison immediately asked if something was wrong. And David, despite his fears, despite knowing how insane it would sound, told him everything. To his credit, Morrison didn't immediately dismiss him as crazy. As the lieutenant had spent enough time in extreme environments to know that when a trained observer reports something unusual, you take it seriously. He followed David outside, and together they checked the instruments. Morrison wasn't a meteorologist, but he knew how to read basic weather equipment from his Navy training. He saw the same impossible readings. He looked up at the sky and saw the same violet bands of geometric light. They stood there together in silence for a long moment. Then Morrison did something that probably saved David's sanity. He believed him. Not because he understood what was happening, but because he could see it too. Whatever was occurring, it wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't polar madness. It was real, and it was being recorded by multiple independent instruments. Morrison made a decision. Yet they would document everything: photographs, written observations, continuous instrument readings. If this was some kind of unprecedented atmospheric phenomenon, they needed a complete record. He ordered David to maintain his regular observation schedule and to note any changes, no matter how small. He instructed the radio operator to transmit David's reports to the coordinating station without any editorialization or interpretation, just the raw data. The response from the coordinating station came back 3 hours later. It was terse and skeptical. Recheck instruments. Verify calibration. Report any equipment malfunction. The implication was clear. They thought Station Echo's equipment was faulty. They thought David had made an error. But the readings didn't change. If anything, they got worse. Over the next 72 hours, David watched as every principle of meteorology he'd ever learned was systematically violated. The barometric pressure continued to fluctuate wildly, dropping and rising by amounts that should have been accompanied by weather events of biblical proportions, yet the skies remained clear and calm. The temperature inversions grew more extreme, with readings at 100 feet above ground showing temperatures 30 degrees warmer than at ground level. But it was the wind that truly defied explanation, or rather, the complete absence of it. Antarctica is the windiest place on Earth. The continent is essentially a massive dome of ice, and cold air constantly flows down from the high interior toward the coasts, creating perpetual katabatic winds. These winds are a fundamental feature of Antarctic meteorology. They never stop, ever. Except now they had. For 3 days there was no wind at Station Echo, not a whisper. The air was so still that when David exhaled, he could watch his breath hang in front of his face without dissipating, forming clouds that lingered like solid objects. He could speak in a normal voice and be heard from hundreds of feet away across the ice. Sound traveled differently in the stillness, arriving with a clarity that was almost painful. The other men at the station were starting to notice. You couldn't spend 3 days in unnatural calm without feeling that something was deeply wrong. The biologist reported that the samples he'd been culturing were behaving strangely, growing at rates far exceeding what should be possible in the extreme cold. The geologist mentioned that his compass had stopped working entirely. The needle spinning slowly in circles without ever settling on magnetic north. The engineers were dealing with inexplicable power fluctuations in the generators, surges and drops that followed no pattern they could diagnose. And everyone, without exception, was having the dreams. Vivid, intense dreams that they all remembered with unusual clarity upon waking. Dreams of vast geometric structures beneath the ice. Dreams of being watched by something immense and ancient. Dreams of time moving incorrectly, looping and folding back on itself. During meals, the men would share their dreams hesitantly, each one relieved to find that they weren't alone in experiencing these nightly visions, but also disturbed by the similarities in what they were seeing. David recorded all of it. Though his weather log had transformed from a simple record of meteorological data into something resembling the journal of an explorer charting unknown territory. He noted the dreams, the equipment malfunctions, the growing sense of unease that permeated the station, and he continued to observe the sky. The violet bands had become a permanent feature, visible both during the brief twilight hours and in the bright Antarctic day. They formed patterns that David was convinced were not random. He spent hours photographing them, filling notebook after notebook with sketches and observations. The pattern seemed to repeat on a cycle of approximately 19 hours and 13 minutes, a period that corresponded to nothing in any astronomical or geophysical cycle he knew of. On the fourth day, February 3rd, something new appeared. David was conducting his noon observation when he noticed a darkness on the horizon, not a storm cloud. Storms in Antarctica have a particular look, a wall of white that advances with terrifying speed. This was different. It was a patch of sky that seemed to be absent of light entirely, as if someone had cut a hole in reality itself. As he watched, the dark patch grew, spreading across the sky like spilled ink. David called for Morrison, and together they watched as the darkness consumed nearly half the visible sky. Within the darkness they could see movement, shapes that seemed to writhe and pulse, forms that hurt to look at directly, geometries that made David's eyes water and his head pound. The violet bands contracted, pulling away from the darkness, concentrating into tight spirals that rotated slowly. It was the radio operator, and a young man named Jenkins who first noticed the pattern. Jenkins had been a cryptographer during the war, assigned to a Navy intelligence unit where he'd spent 3 years breaking enemy codes and analyzing signal intercepts. He developed an almost supernatural ability to spot patterns in seemingly random data, a skill that had earned him a commendation and a standing offer to join the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency after his discharge. Jenkins had been reviewing the weather data David had collected over the past week, partly out of boredom and partly because the bizarre instrument readings had piqued his professional curiosity. He'd started plotting the barometric pressure readings on a graph, expecting to see random noise or perhaps some indication of instrument drift. What he found instead made him forget to breathe. Now, the pressure readings weren't random. When plotted over time, they formed a wave pattern with very specific characteristics. The frequency was consistent, the amplitude varied in a regular cycle, and most incredibly, the pattern repeated with mathematical precision. But it wasn't any natural atmospheric phenomenon. Jenkins recognized it immediately because he'd seen similar patterns during the war. It was a modulated signal. Someone or something was using barometric pressure variations to transmit information. He brought his findings to David and Morrison that evening. The 3 men crowded around Jenkins's makeshift desk, looking at the graphs he'd created. Jenkins explained his analysis in technical terms that David only partially understood, but the conclusion was inescapable. Said the atmospheric pressure changes that had been occurring over Station Echo weren't natural phenomena. They were being controlled, manipulated, with incredible precision to create a carrier wave capable of transmitting data. David felt his understanding of reality crack a little further. Natural phenomena he could accept, even if they violated known principles of meteorology. Equipment malfunction he could rationalize. Mass hallucination was a stretch, but possible under the extreme conditions of Antarctic isolation. But this implied intelligence. This implied intentionality. This meant that something was deliberately altering the atmosphere above Station Echo to send a message. Morrison, ever practical, asked the obvious question. If it was a message, what was it saying? Jenkins admitted he had no idea. The pattern was clear. But decoding it would require knowing what kind of encoding system was being used. It could be binary. It could be something more complex. It could be based on mathematical principles they didn't understand. Without a key, without some kind of reference point, the message was incomprehensible. But David had an idea. He returned to his weather log and pulled out all the data he'd collected on the temperature inversions. He'd been measuring temperatures at multiple altitudes, creating a vertical profile of the atmosphere above the station. What if those readings also contained information? He handed the numbers to Jenkins and asked him to analyze them the same way he'd analyzed the pressure data. 2 hours later, Jenkins looked up from his calculations with an expression of mingled excitement and terror. The temperature data also formed a pattern, different from the pressure pattern, but equally deliberate, equally impossible to explain through natural processes. And when he overlaid the two patterns, something extraordinary emerged. They were complementary, designed to be read together like two channels of a stereo recording. Separately, they were intriguing but meaningless. Together, they formed something that looked like a coordinate system. David felt his hands shaking as he looked at Jenkins's work. A coordinate system implied a location, a place. But coordinates for where? They were already at a specific location on Earth's surface. The coordinates of Station Echo were precisely known. What could this message be pointing to? It was the geologist, a gruff Canadian named Dr. Raymond Hale, who provided the answer. Well, Hale had been conducting his own research using ground-penetrating radar to map the bedrock beneath the ice sheet. Antarctica's ice is thousands of feet thick in most places, hiding an entire continent's worth of mountains, valleys, and geological features that haven't seen daylight for millions of years. Hale's work was pure science, cataloging the hidden topography for future researchers. But over the past week, his radar returns had been showing something unusual. Directly beneath Station Echo, approximately 2 miles down through the ice, there was an anomaly. The radar couldn't penetrate it clearly, but the reflection pattern suggested a void, a space where the ice should be solid, but wasn't. Hale had initially dismissed it as an artifact of the unusual atmospheric conditions affecting his equipment. But when Jenkins showed him the coordinate system derived from David's weather data, Hale went pale. The coordinates weren't pointing to a location on the surface. They were pointing down. And when Hale calculated the exact position using the coordinate system, it matched the anomaly beneath the ice with stunning precision. 2 miles down, directly under their feet, something was waiting, and it was using the atmosphere itself to tell them where to look. Morrison called an emergency meeting of all station personnel. 8 men gathered in the main building's common room, the only space large enough to hold them all. The lieutenant laid out everything they knew: the impossible weather readings, the geometric patterns in the sky, the coordinated message encoded in atmospheric data, the void beneath the ice. He presented it all factually, without speculation or interpretation, and then he asked for opinions. The discussion that followed was heated. The cook argued strenuously that they should evacuate immediately, that they were dealing with something beyond their understanding and quite possibly beyond their safety. The biologist agreed, pointing out that every natural system around the station was behaving abnormally, suggesting they were being exposed to something harmful. The engineers were divided, one fascinated by the technical mystery, the other concerned about their ability to maintain station systems under increasingly bizarre conditions. Dr. Hale surprised everyone by arguing that they should investigate. Whatever was beneath the ice had been there for a very long time, covered by ice that was millions of years old according to his core samples. It wasn't a recent arrival. It wasn't a threat that had suddenly materialized. It had been patiently waiting, and only now had it chosen to reveal itself. Why? What had changed? And more importantly, if they left without investigating, would they ever get another chance to answer these questions? David found himself agreeing with Hale, though he couldn't fully articulate why. Part of it was scientific curiosity. The driving need to understand that had led him into meteorology in the first place. But there was something else, something he'd felt growing stronger over the past week. A pull. A certainty that he was meant to be here, meant to witness this, meant to understand. The dreams had been showing him the way. The geometric structures weren't threats. They were invitations. Morrison listened to all viewpoints, then made his decision. Yeah, they would attempt to reach the anomaly, but they would do it safely and methodically. Hale would lead the expedition, using his expertise to determine the best approach. They would take the station's ice drilling equipment, designed for extracting core samples, but potentially useful for creating a larger access shaft. They would rope together for safety. They would maintain radio contact with the station at all times. And if at any point conditions became dangerous, they would abort immediately. 3 men would go. Hale, because he knew the ice and the location. David, because his meteorological expertise might be needed to understand whatever atmospheric phenomena they encountered. And Morrison himself, because he wouldn't order his men to take a risk he wasn't willing to share. They descended on February 6, 1947. So the Antarctic summer was beginning to wane, and they had perhaps another month before the temperatures would drop to levels that made outdoor work impossible. They'd spent 2 days preparing, assembling equipment, plotting their route, and creating safety protocols. The drilling equipment was transported by sled to the location Hale had identified, a spot about 200 yards from the main station buildings where the ice structure appeared most stable. The plan was to use the drill to create a shaft wide enough for a man to descend, following the path of least resistance through the ice. Hale estimated it would take at least a week to drill 2 miles down, possibly longer if they encountered hard layers of compressed ice. But when they activated the drill, something extraordinary happened. The ice parted almost effortlessly, as if it wanted to let them through. Hale stopped the drill after they'd descended only 50 feet, confused by the lack of resistance. He examined the shaft walls using a powerful lamp, expecting to see the stratified layers of ice that had accumulated over millennia. Instead, the walls were smooth, almost polished, and they weren't quite straight. The shaft curved slightly, following a spiral path that led down into darkness. David felt that pull again, stronger now. He volunteered to be the first to descend over Morrison's objections. They rigged a climbing harness and attached it to a mechanized winch. David clipped in, checked his safety lines, and began his descent into the ice. The temperature should have dropped as he went deeper, but instead it grew warmer. That his thermometer registered the increase, 1 degree for every 100 feet of descent. By the time he'd gone down 1,000 feet, the temperature had risen from -20 degrees to +10 degrees. Impossible. Thermodynamically absurd. The Earth's geothermal gradient didn't work like this, not in Antarctica, not anywhere. The violet light from the surface faded above him, but David found he didn't need his lamp. The ice itself was glowing, emitting a soft bioluminescence that had no natural explanation. He could see structures within the ice, geometric patterns that looked almost like circuitry, networks of lines and nodes that pulsed with faint light. He stopped counting his depth after 1,500 feet, but focusing instead on controlling his breathing and managing the growing sense of awe and terror that threatened to overwhelm him. At 1,800 feet, the shaft opened into a larger space. David signaled for the winch to stop and hung there, suspended in the glowing ice, staring at what lay below. It was the void that Hale had detected, but it wasn't empty. Far from it. Imagine trying to describe a color that doesn't exist, a shape with more dimensions than the three we perceive, a sound that bypasses your ears and resonates directly in your bones. That was what David faced as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. The void was filled with a structure, but calling it a structure was like calling the ocean wet, technically accurate, but completely inadequate to capture the reality. It was massive, easily the size of a city block, was possibly larger. David's eyes couldn't seem to find its edges, couldn't parse where it began or ended. The surfaces were smooth and reflective, but they reflected things that weren't there. He could see himself in the surfaces, but also versions of himself from different angles, different times. He saw himself as a child, as an old man, as someone who had never existed at all. The structure was geometric, but the geometry was wrong. Angles that should have been 90 degrees were somehow both more and less than that simultaneously. Lines that appeared straight from one perspective curved impossibly from another. And throughout it all, that same pattern he'd seen in the sky, the violet bands forming shapes that his brain insisted were meaningful, but that he couldn't quite decode. David keyed his radio, his voice shaking. He tried to describe what he was seeing to Morrison and Hale waiting above, but the words felt inadequate, almost childish in their insufficiency. How do you explain the impossible? How do you report that you found something that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, yet undeniably does? Morrison's response came back crackling with static and interference. They were lowering more rope. Hale was coming down. They needed multiple observers, multiple perspectives. David agreed numbly, unable to tear his eyes away from the structure. Hale descended 15 minutes later, and David heard his sharp intake of breath as the geologist emerged into the void and saw what waited below. They hung there together, two men suspended between the known world above and the impossible reality below, and they tried to make sense of it. Hale's scientific training kicked in. He started taking measurements using a laser rangefinder to map the structure's dimensions. But the device gave inconsistent readings, reporting distances that changed each time he measured the same point. He tried photographing it, but his camera couldn't seem to focus properly. The images came out blurred, distorted, showing the structure from angles that hadn't existed when he took the picture. David noticed something that made his already racing heart skip a beat. The structure was producing sound. Not sound that traveled through the air, but vibrations that he could feel through the ice, through his harness, through his very skeleton. A deep, resonant thrumming that pulsed in a rhythm he recognized. It was the same frequency pattern Jenkins had identified in the barometric pressure data. The structure wasn't just sending a message through the atmosphere above, it was the source of that message. It had been calling to them all along. They spent 3 hours in that frozen void, taking measurements that made no sense, observations that contradicted themselves, photographs that showed impossible things. And gradually, with input from the other men monitoring from the surface via radio, a theory began to form. It was audacious. It violated numerous laws of physics. It required accepting premises that no serious scientist should entertain. But it was the only explanation that fit the facts. The structure wasn't from Earth, not in the sense of being built here, created here, originating here. The materials it was constructed from had no equivalent in any terrestrial geology. Yet the mathematical principles it embodied went beyond current human understanding, and most tellingly, the ice core samples Hale had taken from the surrounding area dated to approximately 15 million years before present. The structure had been here since Antarctica was a temperate continent, since before the ice had claimed it, since a time when the Earth was a radically different planet. But it wasn't dormant, it was active, functional, operating with precise purpose. And that purpose appeared to be communication. The atmospheric anomalies weren't side effects or malfunctions. They were deliberate signals directed specifically at station echo, timed to coincide with their presence. The question that haunted David as he hung there in the glowing ice was simple and terrifying. Why them? Why now? What did this ancient, impossible structure want? Jenkins, analyzing the data in real time from the surface, made a breakthrough. He'd been recording the vibration patterns David reported and comparing them to the atmospheric data. They weren't just similar, they were identical but time-shifted. The atmospheric signals had begun appearing approximately 72 hours before David and the team had descended into the ice. The structure had known they were coming. It had anticipated their arrival and started communicating before they'd even made the decision to investigate. That realization sent a chill through David that had nothing to do with the temperature. Prescience, foreknowledge, the ability to perceive or influence future events. If the structure possessed that capability, then everything that had happened, the strange weather, the encoded messages, and even David's last-minute assignment to Station Echo replacing a sick colleague might have been orchestrated. They weren't discovering the structure. They were being brought to it. Morrison made the call to ascend. They'd gathered all the data they could safely collect, and staying longer risked both their physical safety and quite possibly their sanity. David and Hale agreed, though both men felt a strange reluctance to leave. The pull David had been feeling was stronger than ever, a magnetic attraction to the structure that made ascending feel like swimming against a powerful current. They reached the surface as the Antarctic twilight was beginning, the sun hovering just above the horizon, painting the ice in shades of orange and red that seemed prosaic and mundane after the otherworldly violet light of the depths. As the other station personnel helped them out of their harnesses, their faces tight with anxiety and curiosity. Everyone gathered in the main building for a debriefing. Morrison laid it out clearly. They had documented something extraordinary, something that would require extensive analysis by experts far beyond their small team. He would transmit a full report to the coordinating station immediately, along with all the data, photographs, and measurements they'd collected. He expected that a larger expedition would be organized to investigate the structure properly, probably by the following Antarctic summer season. The report was transmitted on February 7th at 0800 hours. And then something very strange happened. Nothing. No acknowledgement, no follow-up questions. no excited demands for more information. And the coordinating station simply confirmed receipt of the transmission and went silent. David spent the next 2 days monitoring his weather instruments and watching the sky. The atmospheric anomalies were diminishing. The barometric pressure readings were returning to normal ranges. The temperature inversions were resolving. The violet bands in the sky were fading, becoming less distinct, less geometric. It was as if the structure, having accomplished its purpose of bringing them to it, was returning to dormancy. On February 10th, they received a transmission from the coordinating station. It was brief and unambiguous. Station Echo was to cease all research activities immediately. All data collected over the past 2 weeks was to be packaged and prepared for transport. But an evacuation ship would arrive within 72 hours to extract all personnel and equipment. The station was being decommissioned, effective immediately. No explanation was offered. No discussion was permitted. Morrison tried to query for more information, but the coordinating station refused to elaborate. They had their orders. The decision had been made at the highest levels. Station Echo was closed. The ship arrived on February 13th, right on schedule. The extraction was efficient and thorough. Every piece of equipment was cataloged and removed. Every document was collected and sealed. The station buildings were left standing. The cost of dismantling them exceeded their value, but they were stripped of anything useful. Within 24 hours, Station Echo went from an active research outpost to a ghost town of empty structures slowly being buried by the perpetual Antarctic snow. David stood on the deck of the evacuation ship, watching the station recede into the distance, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would never be allowed to return. Whatever he had seen beneath the ice, whatever that structure represented, it had been deemed too sensitive, too dangerous, or too inexplicable for continued investigation, at least not by civilian scientists, not by people who would ask questions and demand answers. The trip back to civilization took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of mandatory debriefings, of written statements, of signing non-disclosure agreements that threatened severe legal consequences for anyone who spoke about what they'd witnessed. The documents were vague about what specifically they couldn't discuss, but the implication was clear. Everything, all of it. The entire experience at Station Echo was to be forgotten, buried, erased from history. David was informed that his weather logs from the 2-week period had been classified at the highest level. His personal notebooks were confiscated. The photographs he'd taken were seized. Even his personal letters home, routine correspondence he'd written before the anomalies began, were reviewed and redacted. It was as if those 2 weeks had been excised from the timeline, leaving a gap that official records would never acknowledge. When they finally reached port in New Zealand, the 8 men from Station Echo were separated, different transportation arrangements, different destinations. A clear message that they were not to maintain contact, not to discuss their shared experience, not to compare notes or seek each other out. David never saw Morrison again, or Hale, or Jenkins. The others scattered to the winds, each one carrying the weight of what they'd witnessed in isolation. David returned to his position in Alaska, but found he couldn't settle back into the routine. Every barometric reading reminded him of the impossible pressure fluctuations. Every temperature measurement made him think of the inversions that shouldn't exist. And every clear night, he would look up at the sky and remember the violet geometric patterns that had danced above Station Echo. He tried once to submit a paper to a meteorological journal. A carefully worded piece that discussed unusual atmospheric phenomena without mentioning Antarctica or the structure or any of the classified details. It described theoretical conditions under which pressure and temperature might behave in unexpected ways. It was rejected within a week. The editor's note was polite but firm. The scenarios described were physically impossible, and publishing them would damage the journal's credibility. That's when David understood the full scope of what had been done. It wasn't just that he was forbidden from speaking about what he'd seen. The very concepts he might use to discuss it obliquely had been poisoned. Any attempt to introduce the ideas into scientific discourse, even theoretically, would be rejected as impossible by his peers. The silence wasn't just enforced by legal threats. Yet it was reinforced by the scientific community's own gatekeeping mechanisms. Over the following years, David kept watch for any hint that the structure was being investigated. He scoured military budgets for unexplained Antarctic expenditures. He monitored scientific journals for papers about that region. He looked for anything that might indicate a follow-up expedition. And he found nothing. Or, more accurately, he found absences, gaps in the record, research programs that started and then quietly ended, scientists who published prolifically on Antarctic topics who suddenly shifted to other fields without explanation. David Carmichael died in 1993, 46 years after his experience at Station Echo. He was 78 years old, still working part-time as a consultant for the National Weather Service, so still watching the skies, still waiting for answers that never came. In his final months, suffering from the cancer that would eventually kill him, he violated his non-disclosure agreement. He wrote it all down, every detail he could remember, every measurement, every impossible reading, every moment of his descent into the ice and his encounter with the structure that couldn't exist. He sealed the document and left instructions with his lawyer. It was to remain sealed for 50 years after his death, not to be opened until 2043. By then, he reasoned, everyone involved would be dead. The security classifications would have expired. The need for silence would have ended. And perhaps, just perhaps, humanity would be ready to confront the questions his experience had raised. But the document leaked early. But in 2021, a researcher going through the lawyer's archived papers found it. It was uploaded to the internet, dismissed by most as an elaborate hoax, but seized upon by a small community of people who believed. They cross-referenced David's account with declassified military documents. They found records of Station Echo's existence, its sudden closure, the evacuation. They found gaps in the Antarctic research timeline that aligned perfectly with David's story. And they found something else, something David never knew. He wasn't the only one. Over the decades since 1947, there had been other incidents, other research stations experiencing impossible phenomena, other scientists collecting data that violated known physics, all of it classified, all of it buried. A pattern of encounters with something in Antarctica that defied explanation. The structure beneath the ice, if David's account is true, is still there, waiting, dormant or active, watching or sleeping, impossible to know. Station Echo's buildings have been buried by 70-plus years of accumulating snow, but satellite imagery shows anomalous readings from that region, temperature variations that don't match surrounding areas, magnetic fluctuations, atmospheric disturbances. And here's what should keep you awake at night. If the structure could anticipate David's arrival, if it could manipulate the atmosphere to send messages, if it's been sitting under miles of ice for 15 million years, what is it waiting for? What conditions need to be met? What threshold needs to be crossed before it activates fully, but before it reveals its true purpose? David's data, the measurements he took during those 2 weeks in 1947, contradicted all records, not because his instruments were faulty or because he made errors. They contradicted all records because they were recording something that shouldn't be possible according to our understanding of atmospheric physics. And that's the most terrifying part. Not that the data was wrong, but that it was right. That our models of how the atmosphere behaves, how pressure and temperature and wind work, are incomplete. That there are conditions under which the rules change, and those conditions can be artificially created. Think about what that means. If the structure could alter atmospheric conditions over a localized area with that degree of precision, what else could it do? But could it affect weather patterns globally? Could it be responsible for unexplained meteorological events throughout history? Those freak storms that appear from nowhere? Those calms that descend when they shouldn't? Those temperature anomalies that scientists struggle to explain? How many of them are natural? And how many are the structure flexing its capabilities, running tests, preparing for something? And why Antarctica? What is it about that continent, that location, that made it the perfect place for something to wait? The ice preserves, it isolates, it creates an environment so hostile that human presence is minimal and temporary. If you wanted to hide something, if you wanted to ensure that it wouldn't be disturbed for millions of years, Antarctica would be ideal. The structure's placement wasn't random. It was strategic. David spent the last 46 years of his life haunted by questions. Who built it? When? For what purpose? Was it a message, a warning, a beacon, a weapon, a tool, a test? Was it meant for us specifically, or are we just the first species to reach a level of technological sophistication sufficient to detect its signals? And perhaps most troubling of all, are there others? Is the one beneath Station Echo unique, or is it part of a network scattered across the planet or beyond, waiting for some signal to activate? The violet geometric patterns David saw in the sky that he photographed but whose images were confiscated, were they a language? Mathematics that our current understanding can't parse? Instructions that were not yet advanced enough to follow? Or were they something else entirely? As something that doesn't fit into our categories of communication and meaning? Jenkins, the cryptographer who identified the signals encoded in the atmospheric data, was convinced he'd only scratched the surface. He believed the message was layered, containing multiple levels of information that would only become clear with more advanced decoding techniques. He told David in their final conversation before being separated that he felt like someone from the Middle Ages trying to understand a computer program. The symbols were visible, the pattern was detectable, but the context required to comprehend their meaning was beyond his grasp. Now here's where it gets even stranger. In 2022, a team of researchers published a paper about subsurface radar mapping of Antarctica, routine scientific work. Mapping the bedrock topography beneath the ice. And buried in their data, in a footnote that most readers probably skipped over, they mentioned an anomalous return approximately 2 miles beneath the surface in a region they didn't specifically name, but whose coordinates, when cross-referenced, align almost exactly with Station Echo's location. The paper described the anomaly as a possible void or cavity in the ice, potentially a subglacial lake, though the radar signature was unusual and warranted further investigation. The authors noted that the reflection patterns didn't match any known geological formation and suggested that targeted drilling would be necessary to resolve the mystery. That paper was published in March of 2022. The authors announced plans for a follow-up expedition to investigate the anomaly. Pending funding approval. The funding was approved in May. The expedition was scheduled for the Antarctic summer of 2022 to 2023, and then in July the project was quietly canceled. No explanation in the public record. Just a brief notice that the research would not proceed as planned due to logistical complications. But if you dig deeper, if you look at the timing, you find something interesting. The project cancellation came exactly 2 weeks after David Carmichael's leaked document began circulating widely online. 2 weeks after his account of Station Echo, the structure and the impossible atmospheric phenomena became public knowledge. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe someone, somewhere, decided that public attention on that specific piece of Antarctic ice was undesirable. The question that haunts researchers today, the ones who believe David's account, who've seen the patterns, who've connected the dots, is simple. What happens when we can't avoid investigating anymore? Climate change is melting Antarctic ice at accelerating rates. The ice sheet that has covered the structure for 15 million years is thinning. Satellite measurements show that the region around Station Echo's former location has lost approximately 30 feet of ice thickness over the past 50 years. At current rates, the structure could be exposed to the surface within a few centuries, possibly sooner. What happens then? When it's no longer buried, no longer isolated, no longer hidden beneath miles of frozen water? Does it activate fully? Does it continue its patient wait? Does exposure to sunlight or air or the modern atmosphere trigger some pre-programmed response? We don't know, because the only people who've seen it aren't talking, and the data they collected has been locked away in classified archives that may never be opened. David Carmichael's story, whether you believe it or dismiss it as an elaborate fiction, raises questions that don't have comfortable answers. Our understanding of atmospheric science is built on centuries of careful observation, mathematical modeling, and experimental verification. It's robust, reliable, and has allowed us to predict weather patterns with increasing accuracy. But it's also built on the assumption that we've seen the full range of possible atmospheric behaviors, that our instruments, measuring conditions across the globe for decades, have captured all the variations that can occur. David's data says that assumption is wrong. His instruments, calibrated carefully, maintained properly, operated by a trained professional, recorded conditions that violate our models. And the most unsettling part isn't that the instruments might have been affected by some unknown phenomenon. It's that they might have been recording accurately, faithfully documenting reality, and reality is stranger than our theories allow. In meteorology, there's a concept called ground truth, the actual conditions that exist, as opposed to what models predict or instruments measure. David's experience suggests that our ground truth is incomplete, that there are atmospheric states we haven't accounted for, behaviors we haven't modeled, forces we haven't recognized. And if the atmosphere can behave in ways we don't understand, controlled by something we didn't build and can't explain, then what else about our world is based on incomplete information? The structure beneath Antarctic ice, if it exists, if David's account is accurate, represents a challenge to our understanding of human history and our place in the universe. It suggests that we're not the first intelligence to operate on this planet, that long before humans evolved, something else was here, building impossible things, embedding them in the ice, waiting for what? We don't know. For whom? Maybe for us. Maybe for whoever comes after us. Maybe for something we can't even imagine. And so the mystery remains. David's data, locked in classified files or lost entirely, told a story that couldn't be told. His measurements contradicted all records because they were measuring something that all other records missed. His instruments saw through the veil of normalcy to something underneath, something ancient and patient and profoundly alien. The Antarctic ice continues its slow revelation, thinning year by year, bringing that structure closer to exposure. And somewhere, in government offices and military installations and scientific laboratories, people who know more than they're allowed to say watch and wait and prepare for whatever comes next. They've seen the data that can't be shared. They've read the reports that don't officially exist. They know what David knew, that underneath the ice, something is waiting. And someday, perhaps soon, perhaps in a future that David's structure could already see, it will wait no longer. The sky above Antarctica still sometimes shows those violet bands, faint now, barely visible, but there for anyone who knows to look. The atmospheric pressure still fluctuates in that region in ways that models struggle to predict. And every so often a researcher records data that doesn't fit, measurements that violate known principles, readings that contradict all previous records. Most dismiss these as instrument error, calibration issues, explicable anomalies. But some wonder, some remember, some know that in 1947 a meteorologist named David Carmichael stood at the edge of the world and looked into an abyss that looked back. His data contradicted all records, and maybe, just maybe, that's because the records were never complete to begin with. Maybe there's a deeper truth, hidden beneath miles of ice, and encoded in atmospheric signals that we're only beginning to understand. Maybe we're not alone in the universe, or even on our own planet. Maybe the biggest mysteries aren't out in space, but down in the ice, waiting for the day when we're ready to face them, or when they decide we've waited long enough. What do you think happened at Station Echo? Is David's account a warning we should heed, or a story too strange to be true? The answers are out there, buried in ice or classified in files we'll never see. But the questions remain, and they're more important now than ever. Because if David was right, if what he saw was real, then everything we think we know about our world, our atmosphere, and our history needs to be reconsidered. And that's a truth that some would rather keep frozen, hidden, and buried beneath the ice at the bottom of the world. But ice melts, secrets surface, and truth, no matter how impossible, has a way of emerging into the light. Just like that structure, patient and ancient, waiting for its moment to change everything we thought we knew.